Okay, welcome everyone to this CIM MES Discussion Group meeting. It's my pleasure today to have a panel with us, and the topic is what will it take to keep women in mining and create a truly diverse and inclusive industry. First, I'd like to tell you a little bit about MES for those who don't know. We work towards furthering education in mineral economics. To that end, we raise money and support various educational initiatives and activities in mineral economics at Canadian universities. We have funded adjunct professors in the past. We hold a student day, and we have other activities for students and young professionals. And we also have professional development for those across the board. And so this is part of the CIM, which is the Canadian Institute of Mining, Metallurgy and Petroleum. And we encourage everyone here to consider becoming a member of the national organization. So it does support those in the industry in many different ways, and holds a lot of events that could be of interest to you. MES is one society out of 11, and there are a number of chapters across Canada and internationally as well. So I think 30 of them. So it's quite a big organization, and there's lots for everyone there. So today I'm going to start by welcoming our first speaker. We have 3 speakers lined up for you, and then we'll have an extended Q&A session. We're going to start off today with Hannah Ellix. She's from McKinsey and Company. She's an associate partner there in the company's mining and metals practice. Her focus is typically on major transformations, bridging operations, maintenance, and procurement, and has run projects on these themes spanning 18 mining sites and metal plants over the past decade. Hannah is a leader in McKinsey's asset productivity service line, specializing in frontline maintenance execution excellence. She co-led McKinsey's research on 2021 on women in mining, and has been a thought partner to several major mining companies over the last several years on how to better support women in their ranks. So Hannah, I'm going to allow you to get your presentation up. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. All right. And apologies in advance for any squeaks and squawks you hear from downstairs. I've got 2 kids isolating again from daycare because the pandemic still hates me. All right, I thought we'd start with why diversity even matters. And it might seem obvious to some people, especially if you've joined this call because it's something that you're passionate about. And yet I often do find that people struggle to formulate the why. So I think the most obvious argument is the value to individuals and communities. Mining companies in particular, in a lot of remote locations, are the lifeblood of the communities that surround them. And when we have inequitable access to positions within companies, that has a huge impact on the communities that they support. And so, you know, just logically thinking about sharing opportunities, I think is wildly important. And, you know, the flip side of that is think about how much labor and talent companies are leaving on the table and missing out on if they aren't open to different genders, different ethnicities, different educational backgrounds, and the gamut of what diversity means. And so I think this liaises into the value to companies themselves. It's no surprise that mining is facing some massive challenges heading into this decade that probably do require new ways of thinking and new sources of talent. Based on, you know, booms and busts of the past, in many commodities, there is an upcoming cliff of retirements within mining. So the sheer number of positions to backfill is augmenting. The nature of work is changing. There's a huge leap towards digital and analytics and automation. And that's a different skill set from the ones that a lot of mining companies have traditionally recruited. And then finally, the imperative towards environmental sustainability, and I would add to that probably, you know, corporate responsibility and community engagement are higher than they have ever been, which again requires just a different way of thinking at a huge scale. It's always been there within the industry, but I think that the scale of the challenge and the urgency of the challenge has perhaps changed. So that's one component of it. Across industries, McKinsey's done a bunch of research that has actually shown that financially, companies that are in the top quartile for diversity, in other words, have the most diverse employee makeup, are up to 36% more likely to financially outperform companies in the bottom quartile for diversity. And this, the range depends on the exact industry and the period of measurement and so on. But all this to say, multiples higher financial performance for companies that are more diverse and more equitable. What could be driving some of this? BP has some interesting internal research that they've published externally since on their diverse teams, which actually show productivity as well as safety improvements from teams that are not monolithic. The teams at BHP's own sites have 76% lower total recordable injury rates, which is a massive difference, and tends to actually be 10 to 11% more adherent to production schedules, which begins to help us understand where could some of this financial uptick be coming from. So look, I think a lot of companies think of improving diversity as this irritating thing to solve, right? They know that they should, or they feel pressure from the boards to do so. But I think a bit of a reframe is needed, where actually this is a huge opportunity for companies that are faced with all these challenges to actually make meaningful improvements in their own performance and future. So where are we now? This is actually not mining specific. This is across energy, utilities, metals, and mining. 2020, the top pipeline here shows the percentage, and this doesn't have ethnicity overlaid on it, but just by gender, from entry level, what percentage of folks are male on the top versus female on the bottom. And so we see that at entry level, it's about 60-40. So starts pretty skewed. And then we see a massive decline in the share of women into that first manager position. And then we see a steady trickle all the way down to SVP. C-suite board, there can be a bit of a correction sometimes because mining companies will actually poach senior women from other industries to come sit on the board or in the C-suite in often roles that don't necessarily require a mining background. So think CHRO, CFO. It's not typically going to be the head of ops, and it's not typically going to be the CEO if you think about it. So we see where the challenge starts, which frankly is from entry level, and we see how the challenge actually becomes more and more acute through the career pipeline. I think the frustrating thing is Bloomberg showed that the percent change in this in the overall representation of women in the industry was only about 1% every 5 years, which I mean is virtually negligible. And I know that companies have been working on it really hard for a while, and so it suggests that there are challenges that have not yet been uncovered or solved. McKinsey set out to figure out what some of those challenges were and what works. And so we launched this survey in 2020, got over 1,000 responses from 52 different countries in partnerships with a bunch of different organizations, including Women in Mining, PDAC, and others, which we think is representative of a broad spectrum of experiences from, again, entry level through to C-suite executives. We asked a series of questions across 3 themes that relate to attraction into the industry, retention of folks, and then promotion through the pipeline. And if there's one thing that I want you to remember today, it's this 3-part lens on what it takes to change diversity outcomes. It's not just attraction, it's not just retention, it's not just promoting diverse candidates. It's actually tackling all 3. And I think the single biggest insight that we got was that most companies are failing at this because they're only tackling one piece. And so let me give an example, right? An example would be a company that puts a ton of effort into creating a partnership with a local college for heavy duty mechanics, let's say, and also for engineers, and also for a bunch of other skills that they require. So they create this partnership, they get a bunch of new women into their early tenure pipeline, and within 3 to 5 years, they lose them all again. That's because they haven't thought about the retention piece or the career progression piece. And so it almost, I don't want to say negate, but frankly, almost negates the effort put in on one component when you don't tackle all three together. Let's go a little bit deeper. Let's talk about the promotion gap, because this is probably one of the biggest differences that we saw between male and female respondents. Fully 44% of women globally do not believe that they have equal employment opportunities within the mining sector. And when it comes to promotions, what we heard most often was women are held to a higher bar. A bunch of other research supports this, industry agnostic. Harvard Business School has shown a few times that the conversation surrounding promotions for men tends to focus on language to do with the person's potential, their intrinsics. Do we believe in this guy? Not to say that they aren't talented. Typically they really are, but it's all about where is this person going? Whereas conversations about women and other minorities tend to focus on what has she demonstrated? So it's almost like the woman or diverse candidate needs to be doing the role that they're going to be promoted into before they can actually get that promotion. And this has been shown time and time again. This is matched within the mining sector with one of the most persistent pay gaps of any industry, which feeds into this intense sense of frustration and disillusionment for a lot of women when they reach that first sort of non-transition, as it often ends up being, into manager roles. Another finding was a feeling of lack of support. This is the cultural and retention dynamic here. 27% of women in the population felt actively supported. That's fantastic. But the rest all felt sort of intermittently, inconsistently supported or actively undermined. This can play out in three ways, what we call structural, personal, and professional. Structural support is the most basic. It's things like, are there single-sex facilities for changing or for washrooms? It is shocking how many mining sites still don't have these things. I've had my own experiences of having to walk through a male changing room to get into the mines, like into the pit. And it's just like the most bizarre and sort of violating feeling of like going and seeing things I did not need to see in the workplace. It's also things like, return to work, and this is particularly true in the US where women tend to return faster, but applies everywhere. Return to work from maternity leave. Are there facilities for pumping breast milk and storing it in a way that's not awkward and doesn't interfere, right? In the majority of mining companies that I've been to, the answer is a resounding no, and it's such an easy fix. And it's these small things at sensitive periods in a woman's life where they just feel like, man, I don't belong here. So that's the structural piece with a few examples. On the personal side, it's things like the microaggressions, it's things like the comments that are made, appearance related, it's the tone that women get, it's the feedback that they're given about their choices and communication style. And it's also the sense of just not having mentors, right? We hear this a lot from younger women in the sample size of, I look at managers in my group and there's no one that I want to be. There's no one who looks like me. And I don't believe that I can be successful in this company long term. And so, really high performing folks make an exit from the industry into a place where they actually do see themselves reflected. And then there's professional support. And this ties into what we call sponsorship, which I'll talk about next. This is basically, is there a career path and trajectory that people understand with a structure around them to make them successful? What we know is that people advance in organizations when more senior folks are willing to go out on a limb for them. Men often have more people who are willing to sort of raise their hand and say, this guy would be great for this stretch role than women. And what we found was of people who are wanting to stay in the industry versus people who want to leave, women who felt that they had more of these sponsors, so senior folks willing to go to bat for them, were more likely to be willing to stay. This is one of the biggest things that can actually help change the culture in an organization. And it's one where individual men who are more senior can actually have an impact, right? If I share one example, so mining companies we know often value operational expertise as a route into senior roles. Women are often not starting in operational roles. I mean, if we look at the overall mining pipeline, it's skewed even more male at entry level when you're talking like shop floor or engineering. So this is a problem in itself, right? One company, a senior exec was speaking with his accountant who he thought was truly exceptional, brilliant, like asked the right questions, super high performer. He wanted her to stay, he wanted her to lead. So how does he retain her? And how does he make her thrive? Well, it was probably not going to be within the accounting organization. When the head of maintenance left, he brought her in to lead maintenance. What? I mean, no one was more surprised than her. She's like, I've never seen a haul truck in my life. Like, I've never done this. I don't know how this works. And his response to her was, you are smart. You ask good questions. You know the numbers. This mine has never been led by the numbers, ever. Go and challenge things. Go and try to change the culture. And no one's going to ask you to do a lube analysis or change out a final drive. You're not a mechanic. You're the head. So go do it. She did it for a year, completely turned the maintenance organization around. And when a GM position came up, she was an absolute shoo-in for the role and has now been doing that for, I can't remember, 7, 8, 9 years. And so it's about, creating these stretch opportunities and rotations for women to get in areas that they typically otherwise wouldn't. And so I want to finish or lead into my finish on a more optimistic note, which is we found that what attracted women into the mining industry in the first place was virtually identical to what attracts men. Therefore, men can kind of relate, and it shouldn't be rocket science to figure out how to keep women engaged. It's the type and the variety of work. It's the growth and stretch opportunities. The pay doesn't hurt, especially if you try to rectify the pay gap. And so if we think about these sorts of things, it gives us some hints into what we can do. And I promise I'm almost about to finish. Attract, retain, promote. If we come back to this framework, companies that move the needle on diversity are ones that take a menu of these things and implement them. And it takes effort. It takes executive will. It means we need to prioritize these things. It probably means we need to measure them and hold people accountable, which I know can be super controversial, but other folks will handle that in future presentations. I think really sit down and think about how are you tackling each of these 3 pillars, because that's how you're going to be successful.
Thank you very much, Hannah. We'll come back to some questions at the end of all the presentations. We do ask everyone, if you have a question, please put it into the chat group. If you could reserve the chat group for a Q&A, that would be very helpful. And so we'll be able to ask your questions after the 3 presentations. So we'll now move on to Gord Orlikow. He's a senior client partner in Korn Ferry's Vancouver and Toronto offices, where he facilitates the Canadian board practice. Gord has conducted numerous board and executive search assignments for public and private companies, notably in clean tech, natural resources, infrastructure, and manufacturing. In recent years, his practice has evolved to include a wide variety of sustainability-related assignments. He began his career with Cargill and subsequently served as a human resources executive in leading companies across Canada. With that, I'll pass it over to Gord.
Thanks, Jackie. I appreciate that. Let me just pull up the share screen here. Here we go. Well, thank you all, and appreciate you joining us for this conversation. My remarks are going to focus a little bit more on the board equation. Certainly, Hannah and Dorena are going to much more effectively address the management issues, and but I would like to talk about boards, and my remarks will be pretty tight, focused a little bit more in terms of where we're at, but perhaps more in a more positive note about what we can do. So where are we at? Well, you know, we've all seen the numbers, and the numbers, there's a zillion statistics out there with respect to diversity in the mining sector, in the broader resources sector around diversity, and all of them are terrible. They're just terrible. I mean, I wrestled with, do I use disappointing, unfortunate, terrible, lousy in that first bullet point, and they're all disappointing. You know, the numbers vary widely by company size, by maturity of the company, by the sector. But you know, the high water mark, with few exceptions, is, you know, for women on boards, typically, you know, a quarter to maybe 30% of the board may be women. For the more leading organizations, there's outliers like Eldorado that's 50-50, but there, you know, there's not that many. And you know, we see some real differences between some of the leading sectors, like for example, financial services and probably consumer-based organizations, and you know, our extractives industry, mining, forestry, oil and gas, along with technology, really lags all the others. And you know, as a country, notwithstanding the fact that we you know, we have a broad understanding of this issue in Canada, and it's it occupies a fair degree of attention. I mean, as a country, we're at best middle of the pack relative to other global competitors in Europe or elsewhere. And so really nothing to be proud of there. And while we've seen some modest progress on the gender diversity side, and I'm going to say notably on boards, as Hannah just described, less so in management, we've seen little or zero progress with other underrepresented populations, Indigenous peoples, BIPOC, persons with disabilities. And you know, on the indigenous side, especially in this era of reconciliation, and even more importantly from a business perspective, for the mining sector, when so many of the most compelling issues for the mining sector involve access to land, environmental permitting, access to talent in remote regions. The fact that we have such little representation of Indigenous peoples on mining company boards is simply incomprehensible. It's incomprehensible. And you know, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that you know, in the Canadian context, it's just simply you know, the poster child example of systemic racism. That's not to say that you know, it's overt racism. That may be the case in some few instances, but the fact that it's just simply not on the agenda of mining companies is hard to understand. And when you know, there are a number of mining companies that do have Indigenous representation, companies like Cameco, Suncor, Agnico Eagle, Eldorado, Newmont. But once you get off the fingers of two hands, you're hard pressed to find that kind of representation. And that for the mining sector is a particularly glaring gap. Okay, so enough beating up on all of us in the community. What is the good news? Well, the good news from a board perspective is that board progress is easier than management. It just simply is. And you know, that's and making progress on boards delivers strategic benefits for all the reasons that Hannah mentioned, and to the degree that you do have greater diversity on your board, it will accelerate progress in management because different sets of eyes are looking at that issue, and there's going to be different questions raised at the board, and management will have more support to do the kinds of things, the difficult kinds of things that need to happen. There's also a consideration increasingly, now and going forward, that progress on boards there's a lot of external pressures on progress on boards, notably by really all of the rating agencies and institutional investors. They are demanding to see progress on this issue on boards at the risk of withholding votes at AGMs. And boards are well aware of that issue. On boards, the good news is for all of those populations noted above, there's more talent available relative to the need. I mean, it's just simply not the case that the talent isn't available. That is simply not true. And I very much include Indigenous people on that, First Nations representatives. There is terrific talent available in the Canadian marketplace. And they are people who have very sophisticated governance experience, a deep knowledge of the relevant issues, and if you as an organization are unable to identify those individuals because they lie outside your network, well, you should engage with someone like me, because that's what we do. You should get some help. You should get some external support to identify those folks, and you will be very comfortable with the caliber of talent you bring. And for boards also, it's relatively easy to remove barriers. So I really enjoyed Hannah's characterization of the attraction, retention, and promotion. In the board context, this is really more a question about attraction, a little bit about retention maybe, but in the board context, it's mostly about attraction. And so again, if those kinds of candidates aren't in your immediate circle, get some help to do that, and be ready in engaging with those candidates. They're going to be asking some hard questions of you about, is this red washing? If you're talking about First Nations, for example, I mean, does the organization have a genuine commitment to the issues at hand? There are some very relatively straightforward, simple obstacles that can be removed. So, for example, it was the case for a long time. It's going away now, but boards would almost invariably insist on having prior public company experience for any incoming new director on the board. Well, that's an obvious obstacle for any underrepresented group, and so eliminating that as a requirement is easy to do. Explicit sector experience. Having if we're talking about mining company boards, it's likely the case that most of your other board directors already have mining experience. So maybe your board would be well served by having some experience coming in from an adjacent sector that may have more of an innovation culture and so on. So having explicit mining sector experience, one needs to ask yourself if that's really necessary. So maybe just building on that, my second slide just simply speaks to the kinds of things that we can do. We can do as individuals either as a professional or individuals as a representative leader of our organization. And I've done this in the context of some work that we did for International Women's Day in our firm, where we have a very active diversity practice, and I'm building on some of the comments that my colleagues put together. But all of these are things that we can do as individuals or managers to make progress in this area. And so for everybody on this call, these are absolutely challenges that I hope all of us can embrace. First of all, seeking women's input, ensuring women at the table are at the table when decisions are made, and making sure that you gather advice from a wide variety of sources. And women and underrepresented people in your organization typically, they've grown up in a culture, typically a professional culture, typically where their voices don't get heard. So give credit to those individuals. Make sure that they are acknowledged and that their contribution is made. I think importantly, both as individuals and as members of management, deploy the same discipline you use for yourself or your company. And notably, as Hannah indicated, have a plan. I mean, set some targets. You manage every other part of your business by having targets. It's so important to have a really solid, well-aligned understanding of what good looks like, and then work towards that. And equally, if as an individual, you want to see yourself grow into more senior management roles, or you're already in senior management, someone like myself who has an opportunity to be a mentor or a sponsor, plan on that. Put that into your personal and professional development plan, and execute against it, and be accountable for your own results. We've seen some progress in the mining sector in terms of supporting Indigenous-owned businesses, and that of course is a huge opportunity. Mining companies, mining and forestry for the majority of First Nations in our country, that is really their most promising route for economic reconciliation and some source of wealth for their own communities. So we've made some progress on that front, more to go. Being engaged and interested when women or other underrepresented groups are speaking, avoiding assumptions, having some courage, where if something's not right, being brave enough to say that, yeah, that's not the way we should do things. And I think that is especially important for people that look like me. For the white males on this call, it's especially important that we call out those behaviors when we see them, that we shouldn't depend on the individuals who are being subject to some of those kinds of misogynistic comments, for example, to have to stand up for themselves. It's up to the rest of us to be good allies. Engaging realistically with people. I mean, again, for those of us who are have more tenure in our career, that includes younger employees, engaging with younger employees and helping them feel part of the organization and participating. Be a mentor, be a sponsor. Again, of course, people like myself should make ourselves available, but equally, for those on this call who are maybe in earlier years in your career, be deliberate about that. Identify individuals in your organization or individuals that you may have worked with in other lives that you have respect. Seek them out and ask them. You will likely be surprised at how positively you'll be, the response will be. And then, all of us need to be accountable for what we're doing on this front, and asking others for feedback regularly on how your behavior is perceived. It's especially an issue for someone like myself. Like, white privilege is real, and it's important to understand how some of my remarks or some of my actions might be perceived by others. All without usually conscious intent, but with feedback, we can adjust our behaviors. Fortunately, those of us who have daughters, we get that feedback pretty consistently, but equally reach out to your colleagues again at various ages. So with that, I'll turn it over to back to Jackie.
Thanks very much, Gord. And now I'd like to introduce our third and last speaker, Dorena Quinn. She's the Global VP People at Iamgold Corporation, and is responsible for the architecture, implementation, and oversight of global human capital processes, programs, and leadership. She applies more than 20 years of strategic and operational leadership experience and skills in mining, broadcast measurement, technology, and financial services for national and international companies. Dorena is chair of the MIHR Anti-Harassment Committee, Safe Workplaces for All, and council member for DEI at MIHR. So with that, I'll just grab your slides. Slide here and get it up for you.
Yeah. And good afternoon, everybody. And thank you, Jackie. And thank you, Gord and Hannah, who presented before me. So if you've heard, my professional focus is on human capital management and programs. And I thought I'd take a closer look at some lessons learned from really this practitioner and talent lens that can guide us further with our discussion this afternoon. And I'm finding it'll be quite complementary to what has already been shared. So a little bit about Iamgold and the organization I work for. We operate in 3 jurisdictions: North America, South America, and West Africa. And the head office is in Toronto. The largest mine is in French-speaking Burkina Faso, with the majority of our headcount there. And I can share that, the gender discussions are really very active in our organization. We have close to 30% female representation in the business office, not unusual in Toronto and Montreal. And under 15% in our operations. So we could use any of the adjectives that you used, Gord, earlier to describe this modest number. So certainly a lot of work to do in this space. And let me begin with a broad comment around DEI and the question around what it takes. And the provocative results from the McKinsey study and sad and yet courageous report of awareness and action from Rio Tinto that many of you may have seen. And we can really see that it really takes a lot, and it includes a multitude of actions to garner results. And unfortunately, in the last few weeks, since the Rio Tinto report was published, we're hearing more and more that reputational risk and brand is weakening for our sector. And, those are the conversations amongst my peer group. And it means a lot more heavy lifting really is needed to either regain or retell or recreate a story of appeal. Notwithstanding, the summary report from Rio Tinto can really be highlighted as sector agnostic, and many other sectors are using it as a proxy, very much like we are at Iamgold, and the work that lies ahead continues to be foundational in many respects. So looking very deeply into the organization. And I also want to share, listening to Gord and Hannah before me, it struck me that for the past 20 years, I've been hearing similar themes, much broader too in the human capital space, on the war for talent. And to think that those conversations were first introduced over 20 years ago. And as I was listening, it had me ponder the manner in which the world around us has accelerated to address these broader issues, and yet still topics of conversation somewhat within our own sector. Development of young professionals, middle managers, culture, mobility, automation. And then we layer the gender application to this, and it almost worsens the narrative. And really the call to action is to pick up the pace in many respects. And this is where we need to move. And I say this from the HR lens, of course, having the experience with some traditional organizations and some very progressive sectors over the last few decades. And to bring this to light, at Iamgold, for example, speaking of call to action, we find ourselves tackling DI with a few different approaches and in parallel with other integrated practices. So a linear journey just won't cut it for us. And our journey is fairly new. It was in Q4 of 2021 that we really established a separate DEI pillar, and with expertise that allowed us to move beyond working on DEI from the side of our desk. And certainly our efforts are not from a one-size-fits-all model from corporate. And so whatever the DEI objectives, I would say, are for your organization, I recommend that you do so with really purpose and intentionality, and ask yourselves to some very simple questions. You know, is there a budget? Does it have the same rigor, attention as other divisions or other projects or plans? And if not, ask yourself the why. And so for us, it really started with board alignment and anchored in ESG for measurement. We have a 30% by 2030 target, but with a slightly different shift in that our focus is on inclusion. And that will drive what we believe diversity in the numbers. So there's a heavy slant in shifting all of the talent practices to do so. And so thinking of this to operationalize it, if you will, at least know as an organization or as a leader with some certainty what it is that you're striving to change, and have a clear understanding too of where you are at organizationally. And what I mean by that is to be very clear on what exists structurally. So you know what the talent pieces are for attraction, development, retention, but also really the types of behaviors that are needed to create inclusion. And not surprisingly, we know and have seen that all efforts too can succeed and fail with the leadership. So what is condoned or dealt with appropriately, you know, the leader's beliefs, their norms, whether unconscious or through stereotyping or culturally, they all have a huge impact on attraction and retention, and vis-a-vis tackling this challenge of DEI and women in the workplace. So the behaviors really allow one to focus on more than just the D in DEI. And the value is in what I will say is a diagnostic to see if inclusion and diversity is emerging, progressing more rapidly, maybe a bit more seasoned perhaps in your organization. And it pays significant dividends, I found, in formulating action and setting achievement of results. And it really centers around the importance of knowing your organization, your culture, and not superimposing a pre-established plan that may not really fit your company. And there are a number of firms and tools that can really help companies perform this assessment. So this, in my view, will serve to be important because without setting the stage for what exists or doesn't exist before exploring the why, the goals and the targets and action items, it's really, really tough to succeed and even marginally otherwise. So I want to share an example within our company of how this has played out after a diagnostic was done. And it touches on many of the points on the list we have before you. So we have a new emerging mine in Northern Ontario that has a strong partnership with our Indigenous partners and community at Côté Gold. And it's coming into operations next year. So it's through joint partnerships and stakeholder involvement at the top that we agreed to implement a program quite intentionally to increase female representation at all levels. Now, operating at zero with a mine under development can be easier in some respects to build action and set targets. And also true because we're here in Canada and have much more mature assets globally that we can draw some learning from. But in this case, we set our intentionality with a statement too. You know, we're committed to creating a pipeline of talent to improve the representation of women in mining, and more specifically in the leadership roles. And so we're currently working through our our operational readiness plans. However, our objective is to achieve 40% representation of women in operations by 2025, with 20% representation of women in leadership roles by 2030. Now, this target is slightly higher than the global one, with the added advantage we feel with a Canadian workforce, access to tools, new immigrants, ability to operate in the Timmins region as well. So therefore, all of our surrounding programs, the talent focus from recruitment to development and retention are at the center. You know, some examples like the recruitment ads are being closely monitored to ensure we don't write out statements like, you know, 10 plus years consecutive experience without acknowledging that women may have had zigzag careers or other comparable experience to bring to the table. Hannah, you touched on this earlier as well. And, you know, in stating the obvious, but sometimes missed is writing job ads with inclusive language, you know, and thinking about our performance management tools and what succession looks like. You know, does it lean towards male competencies? And this is something we wouldn't have been so aware of hadn't we looked at this structural piece or maturity level through our diagnostic as a company. And, you know, we're also active in the community, the high school, colleges, and with our Indigenous community affiliates. We learned so much from Courageous Conversations series that we had within our company that was held by corporate affairs and community relations. And this is in another arm of our business. You know, and another example is we're drawing on Bystander intervention program. Gord, you touched on this a little much earlier around having a voice as a male and speaking up. And we're rolling this out in other parts of our business. And all of the health and safety plans, as we do at our sites, are now going to have psychological and physical safety in mind, right? So psychological safety is a huge part of inclusion drivers as the data is being presented to us. And pre the Rio Tinto report, if we can just coin it that for now, you know, we started to look very closely at the behaviors, you know, in sexual harassment prevention and inclusive leadership. And it's forming a big part of every supervisor's portfolio, and it's cascaded. And it's embedded not by HR, but by health and safety for all. Given that zero harm and safety is it's a considerable metric in our company, tagging and partnering with HNS is going to be critical for this component of our DEI journey. And so this is where we've spent some of our time understanding and planning. And, you know, I offer the health and safety, the anchor with HNS as it stands as a lever that can be and should be overutilized in this area, and forming it as part of the health and safety culture, the DEI culture as well. And in our company, we do a lot of skill building, whether it is with our female truck drivers who have better safety records than the males. It's a known fact in our sites. Or promote our national succession planning initiatives is going to be a big area of focus. And we learn from what we have done well and continue to build on it, and also look for the opportunities to start new with our new and upcoming mine. And now, while I was focusing on Cote in Northern Ontario, the other initiatives have a global mandate, but with a local feel too. And it's important to test them and rejig with the jurisdictions in which one operates. Here's an example that rings very true for us, and it's having strong female leaders, and also maybe a strong female ambassador, say in HR is a non-issue in corporate as a result of greater representation. However, our management teams in other parts of the world at site are men. You know, the GM is male, the HR manager is male, the health and safety person is male, the HR superintendent is male, and so forth. So in sexual harassment prevention, and we're going to be using the White Ribbon campaign on this, we're rethinking who the right leads are to walk alongside the men, you know, to engage the men. but also to add this veil of perceived connection and safety way beyond just the policy. And it's not to say that the GM or HR or health and safety don't capture this correctly, but as a female at site, where is it that I go to for support? So this is something that is a primary focus for us. Now shifting gears again a bit, we heard some topics of conversation around data. And I raise this for awareness as we see the data around promotions lagging and advancement and just purely lack of entry or early exits. Both Hannah and Gord shared this view too. So looking at the data within your company and looking at the various inputs is important too. Triangulation of data with qualitative inputs if it exists, but also the hard numbers from different sources. You want an example of how this can work. One can track entry and gender, but also you can track mobility of talent and review the performance distribution ratings by gender or marginalized groups. And if you have succession documents, look at those too. And I'm using gender because it's easy. Even if you're not federally regulated or not required to track this, for those of us in industry that are provincially regulated, gender markers are presented in benefits data. So a matchup with benefits information usually provides this information already within HR. And then really to seek out the health and safety data, for example, what does absenteeism look like? Is there any data on safety measures, incidences of whistleblower accounts vis-a-vis sexual harassment in particular? Is there engagement data that one can point to? The intention here is really to have a solid understanding by which plans are developed and measured. And look, all the items I have shared by no stretch of the imagination are perfect. It's a work in progress for us. We have hiccups and the need for change. But the greater point is we have to keep at it with the right people to engage with organizationally and consistently. And finally, my last point is, we heard earlier that we can really draw on support, and that is so true. I think it takes just that from externals too. So thank you for making that comment earlier that we can lean on others for such support. Some of our more recent small wins too have been with associations to promote emerging talent and provide scholarships to female students and graduates in mining, or working with agencies where we engage with potential diverse talent, including newcomers to Canada. So, we already have mandates with external search, so that is continuing nicely on activating females with search partners outside of Iamgold. And, there's mining HR. MIR is in the process of issuing a report to and research that one can draw on for action planning. And, so if I can sum it up, it's this constant cycle of testing, flexing, and changing with an underlying theme around consistency that we all can move towards to advance females in mining. So I'll pause here, Jackie, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you. Lots to think about there. So at this point, I'll open up to Q&A. We do have a few questions already in the chat group. I thought I would just zero in on a few comments, a few, phrases I saw as I went through the material. Mining is a laggard among laggards, and we've seen some of the numbers there. There was a Wall Street Journal article in June last year that was highlighted where they pointed to miners' efforts to attract more female workers. Some of those efforts seem to be falling flat. They did cite efforts by companies like BHP, Rio Tinto, Freeport, McMoran to rebalance their workforces, and saw some increases in the female workers from those efforts, but then they seem to plateau and even fall back in some cases. So there have been challenges and successes amongst the larger companies, but are you aware of what is happening at some of the smaller companies or in particular segments of the industry? Do you see differences? Maybe, is there anyone who could just maybe speak to that first before we take other questions? Or anyone who would like to, if you've seen some either patterns or trends? Hannah, I know you focused across the board. Did you see any segments there that you could identify?
So I don't think we saw a big pattern between larger or smaller players. I think we saw differences in individual companies that decided it was a priority or decided it wasn't. And I think that's kind of encouraging, because it means if the will is there, you actually can rally the organization and make a change. And you don't have to be BHP or Rio to do it.
Yeah.
I can add to that as well. I think the last 2.5 years of COVID have also accelerated some changes, whether big or small. I think there was a question in the chat around flexibility and changes in programs, and I think that's become the new reality, and it's become a competitive advantage, even within our sector. We don't differentiate by size. It's really quite fluid. So to add to that, Hannah, I agree. I don't think there are changes. I think the more robust or mature organizations, as we've seen in some data, may be able to accelerate things. But also, as we've seen with Rio, bring things to light before it may actually emerge with some other players. But that could be quite systemic too.
I think the good news also is if you look at specific job functions, there's been some pretty good progress in some areas. So even in non-traditional areas like truck drivers, vehicle operators, as Dorena mentioned, there's some progress there. But it does go well beyond the typical corporate functions of finance, human resources, communications, and investor relations. There's a very exciting new generation of women in particular, I'd say First Nations also to some degree, coming into exploration as geologists and geotechnical professionals, and they're out in the field, and they're relatively earlier in their careers, but they offer a whole different kind of degree of energy and innovation to an organization, and that would be true in larger and smaller companies. And I think also we see in the sector, if you look at, for example, some of the consulting organizations that are such an important part of the ecosystem in mining, there's probably a slightly higher degree of women, for example, working in those kinds of organizations, maybe in part because they usually offer a little bit more flexible work arrangements and so on. But there's certainly some bright spots out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks for that. A question has come up here. Some of you have seen the chat group. Has this survey been asked to men? I believe you had responses, Hannah, when you did that survey, both men and women, and many, many responses. Maybe you could give people a sense of what went into that.
Yeah, there were fewer male responses, so we didn't have enough for every single question to be statistically significant. But we did find that there was a definite difference, and I think that was backed up by interviews. I think there was a related question in the chat, which was, how do we know whether this is just perception
versus reality?
Exactly. And I think there are a few ways to know. First of all, the first page that I showed with the funnel, I mean, that's data, it's fact, it's not perception, right? That's HR data of how many people per level. That's not self-reporting, it's HR data. I think things like the gender pay gap within those roles, right? Again, that is measurable in dollars and cents. That's not perception. I think things like, lack of female changing rooms, lack of washrooms, lack of nursing rooms, again, like incontrovertible, you can't make this up. So I guess where it becomes harder is the cultural elements, right? The softer elements. And there we had some really interesting responses from men within the survey who could identify situations in which they felt that women were unfairly disadvantaged. I remember interviewing one guy who was about 3 years in, and he said one of the things that made the transition hardest for him from university was seeing how women who had been his peers, all of a sudden were seen as like awkwardly inferior. And he gave this shocking example of being in a meeting where this female engineer was presenting something technical, doing fine, technical conversation. She left to go to the washroom for a few minutes, and all the guys around the table started this debate about whether they preferred her hair or her ass. And when she came back, like the conversation, obviously she kept on giving her presentation, but everyone's mind was no longer in the presentation. It was like hair or ass. And he felt it just so wildly undermined her. And now she's not even aware of that. She wasn't there. So this can't even be her perception. Like, it's awkward for some of the people, some of the men who were experiencing this. So I think, that's a data point. I think Dorena also mentioned that, giant report that Rio Tinto commissioned, right? Again, this is fact, it's not perception. That was done super scientifically, giant focus groups, measurements like across both genders, and various metrics of diversity. So I think we can pretty confidently say it's reality and perception.
But I can also share that because within my own organization, 5,000 employees, we did our own survey, right? The whole point of a diagnostic is to understand what are the perceptions, what is the data, and we look at it from both a point in time, but then go back to, some of the elements that I spoke to as well around looking at our attraction. We're losing more females than we can keep. And many of the executives, the males, I will share, were shocked by some of the survey results. I think the most common piece of feedback is we have, these rose-colored glasses on because we see it through our lens. And then in the focus groups and some of the narrative, the women are talking about those comments, right? Or what is being said. And that's part of the culture. And then the point for me around perception or reality, quite frankly, in HR, I don't care if it's perception or reality. The fact that we have this perception, I have to tackle it regardless, because going back to even reputational damage, you're always in a defensive position to make a case for why your organization is healthy or attractive. We want to remove ourselves from that narrative, right? And there was another point that adds to this that was in the chat, and it's around the how and the why. And yes, it is around education. Yes, it is around awareness. So going back to that diagnostic, being very, very aware of what's happening within one's own organization. And then it's driven to accountability and bystander intervention, understanding that if those comments are made, right, is who in the room is courageous enough and has the responsibility to speak up. So building those competencies and those drivers is what, the talent focus for myself is within our company, to ensure that we're driving accountability and affecting that change. And we hope that through all of this, even conversations like today, we just pick up 1 or 2 or 3 more nuggets, and I spend less time debating the why, or does it really exist, and just keep moving forward. And no surprise to anybody on this call, but this is not only about our sector. Okay?
That was one of the questions. Yeah. How is mining doing relative to other industries that you may have worked in?
Yeah, it's the Rio Tinto report is very damaging reputationally, but what it's done is it's kicked a lot of companies into action. Construction, oil and gas, other sectors. There's a great, The Economist did a great run on the Rio Tinto, and it was eye-opening to say, look within your organization, irrespective of the sector you're in. So it's all to say that and for myself, having moved from financial services to technology to broadcast measurement and now to mining, unfortunately, it's been something that we've been battling for a really, really long time. It's embarrassing, but it's true.
Right, right. And so it's not unique to mining, as you say. I guess to Gord's point that you do have to look for the brave souls. And so it's not just bravery at the top. We need brave souls right through the organization who are seeing it maybe on a day-to-day basis to be, able, willing to speak up and help to make some of that change. How quickly is that filtering down, though? If it starts at the top, if it starts at the board, makes its way to management, and then downwards, how long does that take to change where it's so culturally ingrained in some cases?
We're focusing on psychological safety for that reason. I think there was a question in the chat around, you're looking for those courageous souls, but if it's not safe to speak up, you won't speak up. And we saw that in some of the other surveys. And I think it takes intentionality. I can't define it over months, over weeks, but it will be very clear, I would say, in our organization, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, and continues to reinforce that. And again, for Iamgold, at least, we're going to be leveraging health and safety a lot more. And because we know that will be a place on the daily shift briefings, part of our mind-body achievement initiatives, as part of our scorecard where we can tackle psychological safety, the behaviors, and the results, in addition to all of the other pieces, and layer it into various levels and other programs within our company.
Right, thank you.
But it is hard work. And if we're looking for simplicity with DEI, I think we have to treat it like we do everything else in our sector.
Yeah, perhaps it's easier to accept if it is wrapped into the safety question. Gord, you had something to say then?
Well, yeah, just building on that, there's no question that progress starts at home, and it starts with all of us. And so, clearly, we're speaking to the converted on this call. There's little doubt of that. And hopefully we've offered folks on the call some useful nuggets, as Dorena said, and, to advance things within your own organizations or for the benefit of your own career. That said, it does require systemic change, and that does require also systemic solutions. And so, I, for one, am really glad that the institutional shareholders and the rating agencies and so on are putting their attention on this. In Canada, we saw real progress on diversity in the federally regulated sector when close to 30 years ago now, the Federal Employment Equity Act was introduced that primarily impacted the banks and the telcos. They took that on with a vengeance, in part because they had to out of regulation, but in big part because there's the stunning realization that unless they did better on gender diversity, literally half of their potential customer base was going to feel disenfranchised. And so, and that was sort of layered on top of the numbers being highly visible, such that if one bank sort of fell behind their other major competitors, I mean, they'd be called out for that and be reputational damage. And lo and behold, the banks are clearly leading the way in Canada when it comes to diversity measures all throughout the organization. And not so coincidentally, that same pipeline of talent is what seeds a lot of female representation on mining boards, because they do have the experience. So to suggest that what gets measured doesn't get done is just simply like nonsensical. And we can take advantage of the same kinds of approaches in mining. I mean, it's going to be a long, slow slog until it isn't. All of a sudden, we'll reach a tipping point, and then things will start moving. And in the meantime, we got to push past those who are the naysayers and who have always got excuses not to do things. It's up to all of us to be proactive champions of this issue.
Mm-hmm. So to break the inertia where it exists, and the question has come up before, should this be mandated versus just recommended, or allow companies to take it at their own pace, whether that's through attrition or some other form? That's been debated before, and I know people have views on either side of that. Let's just get to another question here in the chat group. It was about the McKinsey survey in Asia, and it had the highest promotional possibilities, opportunities, and they're just wondering what might be the reason for this, because it's contrary to the often held impression of Asian societies. Any thoughts on that?
I think it's probably to do with professional women. So once professional women are sort of in the sector, it's a bit of a different ecosystem than, I guess, some of the stereotypes.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and if there is any follow-up on that, we can get to that. There are comments here on that, senior management, generally good people and not intending to, do the wrong thing, but we know that doesn't necessarily follow. So it's good to have that structure and framework for them, and the absolute what to do and how to do it to make progress at a good pace in this area. So yes, we can work on uncovering our own unconscious biases. There's, I think, many workshops on that being done now so that people understand where they stand. Again, where they think they are and where they actually are could be very different places. And so it does come to understanding, being self-aware. Comments on that. Another question, any lessons that could be learned? What has not worked, for example, in the past? I know that's a question maybe someone might want to tackle here. What have you seen tried that doesn't work, and maybe people could skip past that and get onto something that's going to be more effective?
I'll take that because it answers another question as well, and that is just focusing on the D and the diversity number, and focusing on the number, not changing the behaviors. So Hannah, your description of attraction, retention, and what was the last one now? I'm sorry?
Promotion.
I was going to say mine is development, but retention and development. Yeah, that is the why, right? That's why it doesn't work. And absolutely right in the chat that many of us have been exposed to tokenism of the D, and then all of the fallout with respect to why someone was selected versus someone else. But there are also other ways to tackle that. But I would say it has to be all encompassing and not just the one.
Mm-hmm.
Can I
Hannah?
take that
Yes,
question? Because it's one of my pet peeves on, she just got the job because she was a woman. 40% women at intake, 27% into that first management rung. In terms of ratings, semi-annual reviews, whatever, women are often doing broadly the same as men, equal performers. So I would argue it's pretty much a fact that many men are making the first jump into management and then beyond because they are men. If you want to flip that and say she got it because she was a woman, I don't care. It's not a useful, helpful, edifying conversation. Now, if you take your kid's grade 3 teacher and suddenly make her a CFO, that's weird, right? There will be questions about that. But if you have qualified candidates, then frankly, she got it because she's a woman is just, it's not a comment worth entertaining.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
We just have diverse panels that are made up of men. There are a lot of champions that can appreciate talent and can appreciate having a balanced scorecard to achieve results and then get to an end result, or unleash Gord on them. Who can help create the narrative as a male as to why that isn't the case. But in our organization, yes, and in my experience, it is also a pet peeve of mine, but it is a reality. And it's the same for other marginalized group. It's not only specific to gender, but it's having the people in the selection process, that are trained, that understand, that can use a framework that is free of bias to get the end result, which is the best candidate, and support the females along the way.
Right. So many of the comments that you're making here and that others are making that don't just apply to women, it's other marginalized minority groups. The question here was what methods used to determine the success of a DEI initiative or policies? What's the best measure? Is it a very broad-based thing, or what would you recommend to that as an answer to that question?
So this is where I think data is key, and going back to multiple points of data, you can see it through your metrics, you see it through attrition, you see it through mobility, you see it through stay surveys, exit,
well, safety and productivity,
right?
measures.
There are a whole host of data points, measuring your progress against your last diagnostic survey, as we will be doing next year when you make concerted efforts. That's my phone, I apologize. So I would say there are different measures of success, and it's really the data from the organization as well as the sentiment from the employees. I think quantitative and qualitative data have a place in that measurement. And I'd be happy to talk to anybody on some of the work that we're doing or some of the work that I've done, if this is a topic of interest to them, to help them on the talent side.
Right. And on the board side, Gord, just to bring you in on that, I mean, the measurements and targets, how are those being set?
Well, a lot of them are being set by the same agencies that are rating you on multiple other characteristics about your organization. And if as an organization you're not getting on board, you're going to feel it pretty quickly. It is difficult to go to various kinds of more objective data around production or costs or anything else. But I think in the great majority of cases, even if you're on the board and you're asking yourself whether or not this is something you should do, I would encourage you to reach out to some of your peers on some of those organizations that do have that kind of representation. And the kind of feedback you'll get was, we have much more substantive conversations at the board table. We review a wider range of options. There's a greater degree of innovation. We make faster progress on some of the issues that before stymied us, like permitting and social license. Get the perspective of your colleagues and who are experiencing it in real life.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so we'll just tackle the last few questions. Do you see companies that are starting to offer more flexible working arrangements in mining as a means to attract and retain more women and men? Is that the experience, more flexible working arrangements? Is that a trend?
So it's something that is of interest to us in the corporate offices. No surprise that with COVID and some of the restrictions that exist, at least in Canada and other parts of the world, we have continued and will continue for it to be flexed. As we look outside of our sector to attract talent, as I had mentioned earlier, it is now a competitive advantage to offer and in a steady pace with other sectors. And also looking at the flexibility with the scheduling for those that are at mine or at the camp. So it's a whole review, I would say, as to what works for employees and what we're hearing out in the market.
Yeah, it's more than that. It's not a competitive advantage. If you're not seriously looking at this and making real efforts in this area, employees of whatever gender, and not necessarily your younger ones, they're going to be leaving for other destinations. You really are at your peril if you're not looking at this. And happily, with technology and the rest of it, there's a lot more opportunities for flexibility than there might once have been. I'm not naive about suggesting that this is easy, but the world has changed post-pandemic big time, and it's putting a lot of pressure on organizations in every sector. And to the degree that mining has lagged on some of these issues, mining is deeper literally in the hole on coming through its success.
Yes, I think the pandemic certainly had an impact. Last question before we wrap up. It's almost 5 o'clock here. A mature organization when it comes to keeping women and I would say other minority groups engaged, employed, what would that look like in your mind's eye? Mature, when you're in the right spot. I guess we can always be improving, but you could think of something now, what would that look like? That was one question. Anybody want to tackle that?
I think numerically they'd be pretty close to gender parity. I think they would have closed the pay gap level by level. I think they would have an equal promotion rate. So if you're a woman, you have an equal % chance to get to the next level, which is another HR analysis in the data that you can do. And I think you'd have the facilities, the infrastructure to make women feel welcome. These are the basics, but a lot of companies need to start there. And then I think mature organizations would also have, more family-friendly policies that are of benefit to men and women. I think they would probably have a strong culture of feedback and mentorship, which, by the way, you're provably more likely to get if you have more women, because studies have shown that their female managers tend to invest more hours in development of their people. And I think you just generally have a culture that is more inclusive.
Thank you. Any last comments there, Dorena?
Yeah. To add to that, you really become an employer of choice, and you become very well known for being that employer of choice, because it's so many levers that you get right. And it's definitely the culture that will drive that element of maturity beyond just the number, as Hannah shared as well.
Thank you. Yeah, and this will translate into other things. Your company does better. The investors perceive you better. Your share price, potentially valuation, does better. You have better opportunities on the M&A front. It can spill over into so many things, cheaper financing and so on. Gord, any last comments before we wrap up?
Oh, just, what a privilege it is to be on a call with all of you. Such a diverse group of participants in this call, and the next generation of champions in this space in our sector. And I hope we've been able to spark some ideas for you, and look forward to seeing the successes that you drive, both for yourself and in your own organizations.
I'd like to thank all of our speakers, Dorena, Hannah, Gord, all of you, for your wonderful insights. I mean, it really helps for everyone to hear what the issues are and the takeaways. What can they go and do now? Everyone can make an impact, as we've heard. The issues need to be well understood. We need to be accountable, so we have to measure things, make a plan and implement it, and see that it follows right through. And again, not just about women, but about others, because this is trying to create a diverse and equitable, inclusive industry. So on that note, I'd like to thank everyone for staying with us, and those who came back for the second time after our January event was disrupted. Thank you so much. And again, thanks to our speakers for coming and sharing all of their insights with us. And we look forward to the next discussion group event. It will be in a week's time. So on March 31st, we have a market perspectives and insights session with 2 speakers speaking about world trends and exploration and uranium. So look forward to that. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye.